The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioner clicking on felt loud. No papers shuffled. No whispers. No movement at all. The defendant leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, hands folded like this was a business meeting he already knew the outcome of. He looked toward the bench and spoke in a calm, almost bored voice, the kind that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. My father was the President of the United States. The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Heads turned. Pens froze mid-sentence. Even the bailiff stiffened. Everyone in that room understood what those words were meant to do. They weren't offered as background information. They were a warning. A reminder that some names come with an expectation, that rules soften, consequences blur, and authority hesitates. At the center of it all, Judge Judy didn't react. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even look up right away. She simply sat there, hands folded, eyes steady, letting the silence stretch longer than comfort allowed. It wasn't confusion or uncertainty. It was control. The kind that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. That silence shifted something in the room. The defendant expected acknowledgement. A recalculation. Maybe even deference. That's how it usually worked. Power entered the conversation and the tone changed. But Judge Judy's stillness sent a different message entirely. This courtroom was not impressed. What happened next didn't just shock the people sitting in that room. It forced a much larger question into the national conversation. When power walks into a courtroom and announces itself, does the law step aside, or does it stand its ground? The man at the defense table had spent his life surrounded by influence. He had watched adults lower their voices when his family arrived. He had seen problems disappear with a phone call. Over time, that kind of access reshapes the way you see the world. Consequences start to feel optional. Authority feels negotiable. And courtrooms begin to feel like formalities rather than places of judgment. That belief is what brought him here that day. Not fear. Not doubt. Certainty. Certainty that invoking the presidency, even indirectly, would reset the balance of power in his favor. Certainty that the judge on the bench would understand exactly what he was implying. But what no one in that room realized, not the gallery, not the attorneys, not even the defendant himself, was that those 8 words he had just spoken were about to become the most damaging thing he could have said. Because in Judge Judy's courtroom, names don't carry weight the way people expect them to. Facts do. Intent does. And the harder someone leans on power as a shield, the clearer their actions become. The silence lingered. The defendant shifted in his seat for the first time, a small crack forming in his confidence. His legal team exchanged quick glances, uncertain whether this pause worked in their favor or against it. The gallery leaned forward, sensing that something irreversible was beginning. This was no longer just a case. It was a test. A test of whether privilege would outweigh proof. Of whether intimidation could override the law. Of whether justice still means what Americans believe it means when no one is supposed to be above it. And if you believe the courtroom should be the one place where last names stop mattering, stay with this case. Because what unfolded next didn't start with shouting or spectacle. It started with patience. And the man who thought his name would protect him was about to learn just how wrong he was. He didn't look nervous. That was the first thing everyone noticed once the weight of his name settled over the room. While most defendants sit stiffly, shoulders tight, eyes darting between the judge and their attorney, he sat comfortably, almost casually, as if the courtroom were a place he had visited many times before, not as someone being judged but as someone being accommodated. His posture said this was temporary. His expression said he had already decided how this would end. The suit he wore was tailored to precision. Not flashy, not loud, expensive in a way Americans instantly recognize. The kind of clothing that doesn't beg for attention because it expects it. His cuff peaked just enough to reveal a watch most people only see behind glass. It wasn't arrogance on display. It was entitlement, polished and practiced, worn like a second skin. On either side of him sat attorneys who leaned in frequently, whispering reassurances, strategies, timelines. They spoke to him softly, respectfully, as though he were the client who needed managing rather than instructing. Every so often his phone vibrated against the table. He didn't check it immediately. He never had to. He knew who it would be. People with titles, people with influence, people accustomed to stepping in when situations became inconvenient. A pair of security personnel remained stationed nearby, their presence subtle but unmistakable. They weren't there because he was dangerous. They were there because he was important. That difference matters, especially in a courtroom built to treat everyone the same. This wasn't bravado. He wasn't raising his voice or challenging the judge outright. That's what made it unsettling. He was relaxed, calm, confident in the way someone is confident when they've never truly been cornered. The kind of confidence that comes not from strength, but from insulation. He had grown up watching problems disappear. A speeding ticket turned into a warning. A heated confrontation smoothed over by a phone call. Rules had always existed around him, not for him. Authority figures didn't enforce boundaries, they negotiated them. Over time, that creates a dangerous illusion that accountability is flexible and consequences are optional if you know the right names. Courtrooms to him weren't places of reckoning. They were procedures. Obstacles to be navigated. Formalities that eventually gave way to backroom conversations and quiet resolutions. And judging by the way he sat there that day, he fully expected the same outcome now. He didn't look at the judge with fear. He looked with expectation. Every movement reinforced that belief. The way he listened without really listening. The way he nodded slightly when his attorney spoke as though confirming what he already knew. The way his eyes drifted occasionally to the gallery, not with concern but with indifference. This was not a man worried about judgment. This was a man waiting for the system to recognize who he was. And that is what made this moment so significant. Because cases like this aren't about volume or theatrics. They're about mindset. About what happens when someone who has never faced resistance finally encounters a boundary that doesn't move. To millions of Americans watching stories like this unfold, that contrast is impossible to ignore. The difference between how justice feels for the powerful and how it feels for everyone else. The quiet question that lingers: does the courtroom still work the way it's supposed to? That question is why these cases matter. It's why people lean in when a judge refuses to be impressed. And it's why moments like this resonate far beyond the walls of a single courtroom. Because somewhere between the tailored suit, the buzzing phone, and the whispered legal strategies, the defendant made one critical miscalculation. He believed his comfort meant control. He believed his past experience guaranteed his future outcome. And he believed that authority, once invoked, would bend as it always had. What he didn't realize was that this courtroom wasn't waiting to be persuaded. It was waiting to see who he really was when the weight of his name stopped carrying him forward. Cases like this are why millions of Americans still believe courtroom justice matters, and why stories like this deserve to be shared. While the defendant sat comfortably, the person seated across from him told a very different story. The victim was an ordinary American. No entourage, no advisors leaning in to whisper strategy, no security detail stationed nearby. Just a single individual sitting upright, hands folded tightly in their lap, eyes fixed forward as if afraid that one wrong movement might be misinterpreted. Their clothes were neat but simple. Practical. The kind of outfit chosen carefully for court because first impressions matter when you don't have a famous last name doing the talking for you. They spoke softly when addressed. Respectfully. Every word measured, every sentence careful. Not because they were unsure of the truth, but because they understood how fragile their position was. Their nervousness wasn't guilt. It was awareness. Awareness that they were standing alone in a room where power had already announced itself. This case didn't begin with shouting or violence. There were no fists thrown. No dramatic scene that would make the evening news on its own. Instead, it unfolded the way many abuses of power do, quietly, deliberately, behind the assumption that no one would dare push back. The incident started as a simple interaction. One that should have ended with an apology or a conversation. But the moment resistance appeared, the tone changed. The defendant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned in slightly and said the words that had opened doors his entire life. "Do you know who my father is?" It wasn't a question. It was a threat. The victim described how the air seemed to shift the moment those words were spoken. How the conversation stopped being about facts and became about fear. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of consequences. Fear of what could happen when someone with connections decides you're a problem that needs to be handled. There were references to influence. To people in Washington. To how quickly situations could become complicated for those who didn't know their place. Nothing explicit enough to leave fingerprints, but clear enough to leave a message. This was power used as a weapon. Not to protect. Not to resolve. But to intimidate. The victim explained how they walked away shaken, replaying the moment over and over, wondering if they had imagined it, wondering if anyone would believe them, wondering if pushing forward would only make things worse. That hesitation, the internal debate between speaking up and staying silent, is something millions of Americans understand all too well. And that's what made this case resonate so deeply in the courtroom. Because stripped of politics, stripped of headlines and personalities, this wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about party lines or public office. It was about one citizen standing across from a powerful name and being told, in no uncertain terms, that the rules were different now. As the victim spoke, the gallery shifted. People leaned forward. A few heads nodded slowly, almost instinctively. This wasn't outrage fueled by theatrics. It was recognition. The quiet understanding that what was being described wasn't rare, it was familiar. Judge Judy listened without interruption. No commentary. No expression. She allowed the testimony to stand on its own, because it didn't need embellishment. The calm delivery made it stronger. The lack of exaggeration made it credible. And the nervous honesty made it undeniable. This was not a political argument. It was a moral one. About what happens when influence is used to silence. About what happens when intimidation replaces accountability. And about whether the justice system still has the courage to say no, especially when saying no comes with consequences. If you've ever felt powerless in a moment where someone else believed they were untouchable, this story is for you. Because what happened next wasn't about who had the louder voice, it was about who had the law on their side. The shift came suddenly. Up until that point, the defendant had allowed his attorneys to do most of the talking, content to sit back and let procedure unfold the way he expected it to. But as the weight of the victim's testimony settled into the room, something changed. His confidence didn't disappear, it sharpened. And when he finally leaned forward to speak again, it wasn't defensive. It was strategic. He referenced federal authority casually, as if it were a card he had been waiting to play. His tone was polite, almost respectful, but the message underneath was unmistakable. This matter, he implied, was bigger than this courtroom. Bigger than municipal authority. Bigger than the judge presiding over it. He suggested that what was happening here fell outside Judge Judy's jurisdiction, that it belonged somewhere else, somewhere higher. Then came the word that always changes the temperature in a room. Immunity. Not shouted. Not declared. Introduced calmly, as if it were a legal technicality everyone should already understand. His attorneys followed quickly, reinforcing the point with practiced precision. They spoke of appeals. Of federal oversight. Of how this case could trigger complications that no one in the room wanted to deal with. Their language was careful, but the implication wasn't subtle. Pushing forward would have consequences. There was a murmur in the gallery. Pens moved faster. Members of the media glanced up, suddenly alert. This was the moment many had been waiting for, the point where power tests the limits of the law. The unspoken assumption hung heavy in the air. This is where things change. This is where the system recalibrates. People expected Judge Judy to pause, to reconsider, to soften her approach. Instead, she remained perfectly still. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge the statements head-on. She listened. Carefully. Completely. As if committing every word to memory. The attorneys finished their explanation, clearly satisfied they had made their position known. The defendant leaned back again, posture returning to its earlier ease, as though the matter had just been settled. The room waited. Judge Judy looked down at her notes. Then she looked up, not sharply, not dramatically, but deliberately. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and even, carrying no hint of irritation or alarm. She didn't address immunity. She didn't address federal authority. She asked a single question. It sounded harmless. Routine even. A clarification about timing. About sequence. About a specific moment mentioned earlier. The kind of question judges ask every day, the kind that rarely raises eyebrows. The defendant answered without hesitation, confident there was nothing to hide. His attorneys nodded along, unconcerned. But the question wasn't random. It wasn't casual. And it wasn't for clarification. It was a setup. The gallery didn't realize it yet. The defense team didn't either. They were still focused on the power play they believed had just worked. Still operating under the assumption that jurisdictional pressure and political gravity had shifted the balance in their favor. Judge Judy let the answer hang in the air for just a second longer than necessary. Long enough for the meaning to settle. Long enough for the room to grow quiet again, not with shock this time but with anticipation. Because that single question had done something important. It had anchored the case to a fact. A moment. A choice. And once anchored, it could no longer float above the law. The defendant shifted slightly, unaware of what he had just confirmed. His confidence hadn't cracked yet, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The sense of inevitability he carried was starting to meet resistance, not from argument but from precision. This was the turning point. The moment where the case stopped being about power and started being about proof. And what Judge Judy did next is the reason this case didn't just stay in that courtroom, it went viral nationwide. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice when she spoke again. She didn't signal drama or announce a turning point. She simply asked for something specific. Not broad. Not abstract. A document tied to a date. A call log connected to a precise window of time. And a timestamp that matched the answer the defendant had just given moments earlier. The request sounded procedural. Ordinary. The kind of thing that happens in court every day. The defendant didn't hesitate. He nodded slightly, the way people do when they're confident the details won't hurt them. His attorney answered smoothly, supplying the information without protest. There was no objection. No pause to reconsider. In their minds this was housekeeping, not danger. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took for the paperwork to reach the bench. Judge Judy scanned the page carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She read. Then she compared it to her notes. Then she looked up, not at the attorneys but directly at the defendant. For the first time since he had entered the courtroom, her gaze held him there. She asked another question. Still calm. Still precise. It referenced the same timestamp, but paired it with a different detail. A line item that didn't match the story he had just told. The defendant answered quickly, automatically, as if speed itself could reinforce certainty. That's when the contradiction appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode into the room. It surfaced quietly the way truth often does. A discrepancy between what was said and what was recorded. Between what was implied and what was documented. The call log showed timing that didn't align with his explanation. The document showed language that wasn't casual or accidental. It was deliberate. Judge Judy read the relevant portion aloud. The words sat heavy in the air. This wasn't a passing reference to a famous parent. This wasn't a spontaneous remark made in frustration. The record showed preparation. Intent. A conscious decision to invoke the presidential name at a specific moment, to a specific person for a specific effect. Strategy. The courtroom shifted. The gallery stirred, not with gasps this time, but with something deeper, recognition. Heads turned back toward the defense table. The media pens that had been moving nonstop suddenly paused, then accelerated again. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was proof. Judge Judy didn't accuse. She didn't editorialize. She asked one more question, quieter than the last. It invited an explanation. It offered space for honesty. The defendant hesitated. It was the first real hesitation anyone had seen from him all day. His eyes flicked briefly toward his attorneys. One of them leaned forward instinctively, then stopped. There was nothing left to interrupt. The evidence had already spoken. The comfort that had wrapped around him like armor began to slip, not all at once, but enough to be noticeable. He answered, but the ease was gone. The relaxed confidence that had defined him since the moment he sat down was replaced by something tighter. Controlled. Calculated. The room could feel it. This was no longer someone certain of the outcome. This was someone realizing the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they believed. Judge Judy let the moment breathe. She didn't pile on. She didn't need to. The contrast between who he had been at the start of the hearing and who he was now told the story clearly enough. The trap wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was built from patience, precision, and the understanding that power often exposes itself when it thinks it's safe. By asking the right question at the right time, Judge Judy had done what intimidation never expects. She had anchored authority to evidence. The defendant sat back, but not comfortably this time. His shoulders were stiff. His jaw tight. The illusion of untouchability had cracked, and everyone in the room knew it. Including him. Moments like this are why people watch courtroom stories till the very end, because truth always shows up. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward dramatically or signal outrage. When she finally spoke, it was measured, deliberate, and unmistakably controlled, the kind of calm that carries authority because it doesn't need volume to be heard. The room fell quiet again, not out of shock this time but out of respect. Everyone sensed that the moment had arrived. She began by addressing the premise the defense had tried to elevate above everything else. Immunity, jurisdiction, federal reach. She didn't dismiss them with sarcasm or spectacle. She dismantled them the way a surgeon works, precisely, carefully, and without wasting a single motion. She explained, in clear language, what authority this court did and did not have, and why intimidation does not magically convert a local matter into a federal shield. Then she looked directly at the defendant. This courtroom answers to the Constitution, not your last name. The words landed without echo, without flourish. They didn't need either. You could feel the air change. The statement wasn't aimed at the gallery or the cameras. It was aimed squarely at the idea that power could rewrite the rules mid-hearing. Judge Judy continued, her tone steady. She explained that the presidency, while significant, is not a personal asset that can be deployed at will. It is not a badge that transfers immunity to relatives. It does not erase conduct, and it does not excuse intimidation. Authority, she said, exists to serve the law, not to sit above it. Presidential power ends where intimidation begins. No reaction followed from the defense table. No objection. No whispering. The attorneys sat still, their earlier confidence replaced by calculation. The defendant didn't reach for his phone. He didn't smirk. He didn't shift in his seat. He stared forward, expression tight, absorbing the reality that had finally caught up to him. Judge Judy addressed the jurisdiction argument next, not emotionally but conclusively. She cited the facts already established on the record. The timing. The intent. The documented use of influence. She made it clear that attempting to pressure an ordinary citizen by invoking power, real or implied, falls squarely within the court's authority to examine. Not because of who the defendant was, but because of what he chose to do. Then came the consequences. She ruled decisively against the motions that had been designed to derail the case. Each ruling was concise, supported, and final. She ordered that the findings be entered into the public record, ensuring that the behavior documented that day wouldn't disappear quietly. She directed appropriate legal referrals, not as punishment theater, but as a matter of process, because intimidation doesn't stop being serious when the person committing it is well connected. Throughout it all, the defendant remained silent. This was no longer the man who had leaned back comfortably at the start of the hearing. No longer the man who believed the right words would make the problem dissolve. The armor of confidence he'd worn so easily was gone, replaced by something far more revealing, restraint born of realization. Judge Judy concluded without flourish. No closing speech. No grand declaration. Just a final reminder that courtrooms are not stages for power plays, and justice doesn't negotiate with intimidation. The law, she made clear, does not bend because someone expects it to. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. That earlier stillness had been charged with anticipation. This one was filled with understanding. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed a line being drawn, cleanly, calmly, and without apology. The defendant stood when instructed. No phone in hand. No expression of superiority. Just compliance. And in that quiet compliance was the clearest outcome of all. The moment power stopped working. The reaction didn't stay inside the courtroom. It spilled out almost immediately, moving faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time the defendant cleared the courthouse steps, clips from the hearing were already circulating online. Headlines multiplied. Comment sections ignited. What had begun as a single case became a national conversation within hours. Americans watched the same moment again and again. The calm delivery, the refusal to bend, the line Judge Judy drew without raising her voice. Some replayed it out of disbelief. Others shared it because it said something they'd been waiting to hear. The debate wasn't about politics. It was about principle. About whether justice still holds when power tries to lean on it. On television panels and radio shows, people argued over what it meant. Some called it overdue. Others called it uncomfortable. But even the critics agreed on one thing: the courtroom hadn't flinched. And that, for many viewers, was the point. The victim left the courthouse quietly, not to cameras or applause, but with a visible sense of relief. There was no celebration, no victory speech, just the steady walk of someone who had stood their ground and been heard. Vindication doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like finally being able to breathe. The defendant exited through a side door. No statements. No entourage making announcements. The confidence that had carried him into the building never returned. His phone stayed in his pocket. His eyes stayed forward. For the first time that day, the name attached to him didn't change the outcome. Judge Judy returned to her chambers as she always did. No interviews. No acknowledgement of the attention. She didn't need it. Her role wasn't to react to the noise, it was to do the work. And that consistency, more than anything else, is what resonated with viewers across the country. In the days that followed, Americans kept watching. They debated in living rooms, at kitchen tables, and online. Some talked about times they had felt powerless. Others talked about moments when they wished someone had drawn a line sooner. The case became a reference point not because of who was involved but because of what it proved. That power only works when no one challenges it. And that justice still speaks, when someone is brave enough to listen. The story didn't end with outrage or spectacle. It ended with something quieter and far more lasting: reassurance. Reassurance that the system, when it chooses to, can still hold firm. That authority doesn't have to shout to be effective. And that accountability doesn't disappear just because someone expects it to. If this case restored even a little of your faith in justice, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the next courtroom showdown proves this wasn't a one-time thing.